Hey everybody, it's Erik, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today joined by a very special guest, Julia Galef. Julia is the author of Scout Mindset. Julia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's so great to be on finally.
So Julia, by way of introduction, what is the book about and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, so it's called The Scout Mindset, and that is my term for the motivation to see things as they are and not as you wish they were. So basically trying to be intellectually honest and objective and just curious about what's actually true. And it's part of the kind of central metaphor of the book, which is that we humans are very often by default in what I call soldier mindset, where we're motivated to defend our beliefs against any evidence or arguments that might threaten them. And so Scout Mindset is an alternative to that. The book is about why is soldier mindset so often our default, how to shift towards Scout Mindset, and why that's something you should want to do.
So I want to get into the soldier mindset, but before doing so, why don't we, just by way of an introduction for people who are sort of new to your work, if you were to ask to sort of tie the threads together in terms of the work that you've done, leading up to this book, in terms of like the common questions that you've been asking or the threads that you've been pulling, how would you sort of articulate it?
Yeah, I mean, I've been interested for 10, 15 years now in improving human reasoning and decision-making, often called rationality, although I often don't use the word rationality because it means lots of different things to different people. And often what it means to people is that I think I'm perfectly rational and I think they're irrational, which is not what I mean by it. I'm just interested in, we're all irrational in various ways, and how do we improve our reasoning and decision-making. So that's been the thrust of my career for the last 10, 15 years. I've done various things to try to, train reasoning and decision-making. Like I co-founded this educational nonprofit in 2012 called the Center for Applied Rationality and ran workshops, basically taking concepts from cognitive science and some like basic economic theory and even philosophy, and training people to apply those concepts to improve the decisions that they were making in their lives and their businesses, their relationships, et cetera. And so my kind of like converging on the idea of Scout Mindset as what seemed most important to me, it was born out of the realization that I had kind of been wrong about how to improve reasoning and decision-making. I guess my original picture of what would happen was that there's all this knowledge in the world. There's all this knowledge from, cognitive science and philosophy, et cetera. And we'll give people the knowledge and then they'll use the knowledge to, make better decisions. And, that I would too. I'd use this knowledge to make better decisions. I came to realize that the knowledge is not really the bottleneck. The bottleneck is more motivational. You can you can have memorized all of the cognitive biases in the world. But if you're not motivated to notice them in yourself, then that's not going to do you that much good. As you probably are aware, you've probably seen people online who, are experts at pointing out biases and fallacies in other people's thinking, but never actually turn that lens on themselves. And so I just got more interested in what seemed to me to be like an underappreciated bottleneck in thinking better, which was just, having the motivation to actually, figure stuff out for real and actually notice what you're wrong about, rather than just like looking for ways to confirm what you already believe or what you want to be true.
So the Scout Mindset is not just an intellectual approach. It's sort of like a way of being or something. It's a
mix. It's a mix of things. Partly it's about kind of reframing situations to change your emotions. So I talk in the book about how do you make yourself more open to considering truths or possible truths that might be, unpleasant or stressful or inconvenient. How do you make yourself like emotionally receptive so you're thinking clearly about them? And then it's also social. Humans are social creatures, and a lot of arguably the main way that we learn new habits and new ways of thinking is just from the people around us. And so I also talk in the book about kind of creating a community around yourself, like cultivating a community that values scout mindset more than soldier mindset, ideally, so that you have more of a tailwind instead of a headwind when it comes to developing these habits yourself.
Yeah, let's get into that. But first, maybe you could share more on why is the soldier mindset our default? Why don't you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, so I really wanted to take soldier mindset seriously in the book, by which I mean, it's very easy to write a book or, an article or whatever saying, here are all the terrible biases and fallacies in our thinking, and, we should think this other way instead. But I think anytime there's a default, a way that things are already, you should take that seriously and try to understand why are things this way. This principle is sometimes called Chesterton's fence, after the essayist G.K. Chesterton, who told this parable about coming across a fence in a field and thinking to yourself, why is this fence here? I don't see any reason for it. Let's knock it down. And his point was, if you don't understand why the fence is there, you shouldn't knock it down. Like, go off, figure out why the fence is there, and then once you understand it, maybe you can knock it down. And so I was trying to take that approach to soldier mindset, and basically understand what purpose is it serving for us, or at least what purpose is it meant to serve. And so that is a complicated question, but I break it down into a handful of purposes, and they include things like, well, feeling good, bolstering our egos by kind of massaging the truth in a way that makes us feel good about ourselves, motivating ourselves. So, convincing ourselves that things are going to work out great if we just work hard, or convincing ourselves that we're, more talented or more skilled than other people, and also looking good to other people. So Robin Hanson and other economists have talked about this before. Evolutionary psychologists talk about this. They sometimes call it signaling or impression management. Basically, a lot of the beliefs that we choose, we unconsciously choose them to seem smart to other people, or to seem, edgy, or there's lots of ways you might want to seem. But we kind of instinctively choose beliefs to some extent to, create an image for ourselves. And then we also, sometimes try to convince ourselves of things to make it easier for us to convince other people of those things, because, or at least the logic is that the more strongly and passionately we believe something, the more convincing we can be to others. So that's just some of the ways in which we try to use soldier mindset. And so I want to take those things seriously and acknowledge that, yes, we're not doing this just because we're stupid. There's a reason we use soldier mindset, but soldier mindset also has these downsides. And so the book is about can we get those things that we're trying to get with soldier mindset instead with scout mindset, so that we don't have to distort our judgment in order to be, happy and satisfied with ourselves and motivated and so on.
And so what would an example of that look like?
Yeah. So one of the common objections that I ran into about the idea of scout mindset was from people in Silicon Valley, because I was living in the Bay Area when I wrote the book. And the common objection is basically you need soldier mindset if you're going to be doing something really hard, like starting a company. Because, if you believe 110% that you're going to succeed, that may not be rationally justified, but that's what's going to get you to go out there and try really hard and to persevere when things get tough. And so actually entrepreneurs should be in soldier mindset. And I understand why this is compelling, but there are actually a bunch of examples of very successful entrepreneurs who had a very clear-eyed and realistic picture of the odds they were facing, and they were still really motivated and went out and successfully built large businesses. Like, for example, Elon Musk. When he was starting Tesla and when he was starting SpaceX, he estimated that his odds of success for each company was about 10%. Similarly, Jeff Bezos, when he was starting Amazon, he asked himself, what is the likelihood that Amazon is going to succeed? And he put his odds at about 30%. So the explanation for how someone can expect their most likely outcome is failure and yet still be really motivated to go out there and try really hard and eventually succeed is that both Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos approached the idea of starting a business in terms of expected value. So basically, if the probability of success times the value of success plus the probability of failure times the value of failure is really positive, then a business is a good bet to take, even if the likeliest outcome is failure. And so if you go back and look at the thinking of both Musk and Bezos when they were starting their companies, I don't think they explicitly, actually, no, I think Musk does use the term expected value, but both of them, it's sort of clear from the way they're thinking that they're like, well, the upside is huge and the downside is bearable. And if I make a number of these bets in my life, then, I'm actually, the probability of success overall is actually not bad. So I can feel good about taking this bet, even if the likeliest outcome is failure. And so basically my argument is if you are kind of practiced in thinking in terms of expected value, you don't need to convince yourself that you have a 100% chance of success in order to feel motivated.
And so is there still a role for soldier mindset?
So I don't want to claim that soldier mindset is never a better strategy, just because that would be a very strong claim, and I don't think I can justify that. I've seen other advocates of things like soldier mindset, like intellectual honesty and self-honesty. I've seen people make that claim that like it's always better to know the truth. And I kind of share that intuition, but I've never seen any of them defend that in a way that seems sufficient to me. So I don't make that claim in the book. Instead, my claim is that in at least most situations, when it looks like you need soldier mindset to get something you want, like motivation or influence or happiness, most of the time there is another way that doesn't require soldier mindset. So I give a lot of examples of that in the book, and I suspect that that's the case, at least almost all the time, if not all the time, but I can't actually defend that conclusively, so I don't try to.
It's interesting because there's a phenomena where people say something like, after being successful, they'll say like, if I really knew the odds at the time, I would have never pursued it because it was just, so hard to do and so unlikely that they would have achieved what they'd achieved in their eyes.
Right.
And of course, there's the survivorship bias of like, yeah, maybe they just got lucky. And most people who tried that to the same degree just, didn't end up being successful. And yet that can be true. And also they might not have tried it if they were like thinking from in terms of expected value.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's just not a common probabilistic thinkers. And so I think most people, like, to them, it really does seem like the only way to be motivated is to, is to basically believe that you will succeed. Because if you have any doubt, then that doubt will sort of cripple you. That's kind of a corollary of this common wisdom about motivation, that if you have any doubt at all, then that will, if you admit the possibility of failure, that will cripple you or paralyze you. This is like another version of this common wisdom I've heard. But again, it doesn't really seem to bear out. Like if you look at the way people talk, like people who've done really hard, risky things like starting a company, the way a lot of them talk about how they think about failure is that accepting the possibility of failure is what is freeing to them.
Yeah.
Like thinking about the possibility that they might fail and knowing that'll be okay, I'll be okay. The worry is that that's going to be like a safety net. Like you'll always like fall back if you think you have the safety net. But in practice, that doesn't actually seem to be the way it works, at least for many people. Instead, it's like, now I feel liberated to actually take the risks because I know I'll be okay if I fail.
Right. But is that so I guess my hypothesis would be that I've just thought of on the spot. If you'll the threads would be that if everyone thought from an expected value perspective, a lot of people would tend more to take more of like a portfolio of activities and I get what you just said. People would be more likely to take big risks because they are sort of in the way that you described Elon was. But at the same time, that feels different than someone for whom their motivation is that, I don't know, to pick a random example, that like God has, they're like told them that they need to do this one thing and one thing only, and there's no such thing as failure, and they just need to like go all in on it. I mean, what I wonder is if the scout mindset, if applied more broadly, it would lead to more success for more people, but it might cap some upside just because it's a different motivation than like a singular, sort of existential focus on one thing. How do you react to that?
Yeah, it's complicated. It's really hard to know for sure which way it would go. And there's factors on both sides of the equation. Like there's the fact that some people who would have had the like super singular focus might waver and therefore not try as hard. There's also the potential that, some people, if they view the odds realistically, might decide to opt for like a safer bet instead of the risky high payoff one that might help the world. Those are possible. There's also on the other side of the equation, the fact that, I don't know if I made this really explicit, but like the reason Scout Mindset is beneficial is because it helps your judgment, like to be able to see yourself as clearly as possible, your strengths and weaknesses and your situation, to be able to see the world, the market as clearly as possible, to see human nature as clearly as possible. That's what lets you make all of these tough judgment calls as well as you can. And so, on the other side of the equation is that these people with the singular focus and the unrealistic expectations might just be making worse decisions and like undermining their own success because they aren't, trying to see things realistically. So I don't know which way it would go if everyone decided to be in Scout Mindset tomorrow instead of Soldier Mindset. The claim that I'm comfortable making is that it is perfectly possible, if you want to try to be in Scout Mindset, which I think is a good idea in general, it's perfectly possible to be a successful entrepreneur or activist or do all of these, hard and risky things that require passion while still being in Scout Mindset. So that's a different claim from claiming that everyone in the world would be better off if they switched over to Scout Mindset. But I think it's still a significant claim relative to what most people realize is true.
Right. To pick one sort of, and this might just be a totally different topic, but Moneyball. There's this anecdote where the scouts or the sort of analysts, the coaches, are getting really sophisticated on this sort of like, statistical orientation to discovering talent. And there's this anecdote where a player, they're wondering if like one of their players should get more sophisticated on some element of it. And one of them says like, no, that'll just like confuse him, or it like to like take on, to encourage the player to think in a more abstract way will like take him out of his zone or something. And baseball is different than like being a CEO of a company, and maybe being a CEO of a company is more like abstract, but baseball is like pre-intellectual or something. It's just like, you have to be so present and like, you know what I mean? Do you get what I'm trying to get at?
No, I do get what you're trying to get at. I was just smiling to myself because I do have an example in the book of a baseball player exhibiting Scout Mindset. His name is Trevor Bauer. Yeah. And disclaimer, I don't really follow sports at all. So I don't want to try to talk about the game too much for fear of embarrassing myself. But I happened to see a headline about Bauer, and it piqued my interest because he was pitching really well, let's say that. And the interviewer asked him, like, what do you attribute your amazing success this season at pitching? And his reply was random variation. He said, this is a streak that can't continue, so it's going to fail sooner or later, which just made me grin. Like, how often do you hear someone attribute their success to random variation? People always have some kind of causal story to tell about something they, started doing that, I believed in myself, or I was wearing my lucky socks or whatever. And then the next season, his pitching record was unusually bad. And the interviewers asked him about that. And he was like, well, whatever the statistic is whose name I'm forgetting, is a statistic that the variation is really huge, and it doesn't correlate very much with kind of underlying skill at pitching. And so it's something where there's going to be a lot of regression to the mean. And so again, when he was pitching, his statistic was worse than normal. He's like, yeah, I wouldn't worry about this. It's going to go back to normal. And it did. So the reason that I talk about Bauer in the book is because I think he's a great example of how, like, thinking probabilistically can have a really kind of calming psychological effect, because like without it, like every time luck goes against you, you're just, devastated. And when luck goes in your favor, you're ecstatic. But due to the foibles of human nature, we tend to like feel worse about the losses than we feel good about the gains. And so it's not only very tumultuous, but also like net bad relative to the underlying truth. And so, the equanimity that Bauer got from just understanding the underlying like random chance inherent in what he was doing was, I think, really valuable. And to your point, actually, a few minutes ago about, taking a portfolio approach, I think an underappreciated aspect of probabilistic thinking is that, for any one bet you take, your chance of it paying off may be low, but over your life, you take lots of bets. Like, you can start multiple companies, and you can take risks in your relationships. You can try risky things. You can go out on a limb and have risky conversations with people, or make risky investments, in the traditional sense of the word. And so for any one bet that you're making, you can accept this one may well not pay off. But if you are kind of zooming out and looking at the overall picture, averaging out over the random chance, you can feel pretty good about that, and with a lot more confidence than you can have about any one bet.
Yeah, I think we are certainly in broad agreement that most people do not, or many people do not apply the scout mindset, and that things could be much better for them if they did. What I'm curious to get an understanding, and this is one example. So there's this book, Joseph Henrich's new book on weird culture, Western educated, rich countries. I think he has one anecdote where he describes how as sort of people in the West got better at reading comprehension and synthesizing information, and sort of moved from an oral culture to a text culture, that they got worse at recognizing faces, or that there are some trade-offs. Some muscles strengthened and some muscles were atrophied. Socrates, of course, was didn't like writing because he was worried that our memory would get worse, and maybe there was some connection. And so I guess what I'm curious about is do you think there's any what I'm guessing that you would reject is that there's some trade-off between thinking more abstractly from probabilistically or from expected value on certain things, and becoming more sophisticated in this sort of mode of thought, and any sort of this, what people call being one with the activity, or just such deep engagement or deep present. Because in the mode of thought, you're inherently sort of you're stepping out of the frame a little bit. And some people, and most people, don't have any ability to even step out of the frame. And there's so much to be gained from stepping out of the frame. The question I'm just curious if you'd concede is if there's anything lost.
Meaning the awareness in your mind that this is just one bet that I'm going to be making in my life over many bets, and what really matters is my overall portfolio. That you're suggesting maybe that kind of thinking goes again, or prevents you from being just fully committed to the one project.
That's what I asked. That's what I asked before. What I'm asking now is more if we go back to the baseball player, and you gave one example where the person referenced random variation. The one coach, and maybe in this anecdote, was saying, "Hey, let's not teach this person about these concepts because it might encourage them to think too much." And what coaches often are get your head in the game. Don't think of one risk athletes have is that they psych themselves out, right? And so they have to be so present. And one way for people to be so present is to not zoom out, or not even have the skills to.
It's kind of a subtle question. So what I've been describing about motivation that's derived from a realistic understanding of probability and expected value, even the people who point to that, who have cited that as their source of motivation, and their the drive behind their decision to quit their job and start a company, like Musk and Bezos, I don't think even those people are in that mind space or headspace 24/7. On a day-to-day basis, you're not really thinking about that. You're thinking about the launch that's coming up next week, or you're thinking about the fires you have to put out today at work, or you're thinking about the problem that you are so close to solving, or something like that. And so that's or you're comparing your progress to where you were a month ago, and that's really motivating. So there's all these other kind of day-to-day sources of motivation that don't really involve the probabilistic thinking. The probabilistic thinking is more relevant in those moments when you're kind of A, deciding to take the plunge, or B, kind of stepping back and those moments where you step back and reevaluate your life choices. And so it's in those moments that I think it's really valuable to be able to say even if this bet doesn't pay off, I will still feel good about having taken it. That's a very valuable thing to be able to say to yourself in those moments.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious. how you think about we were talking about this earlier. So there's totally sold on the scout mindset. How can they adopt it
Uh-huh.
more in their personal life? What sort of things can they do to or exercise can they do to adopt it more?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot of different things I talk about in the book. I'll just to name a couple examples. I have a whole section on kind of self-awareness and getting better at noticing when you might be rationalizing or when you might be in soldier mindset. And so one of the thought experiments that might already be familiar to some of your listeners is just I call it the outsider test, and it just involves kind of taking yourself outside of the situation you're thinking about. So, if it's you who has to decide whether or not to fire an employee, which was one of the most commonly cited situations in which like managers or CEOs told me they realized later they had been in soldier mindset, was like really trying to find some reason why they didn't have to fire this person because they really didn't want to. So suppose you're in a situation like that. A simple thought experiment is just to imagine that it's someone else's situation. It's like someone else in the exact same situation with that same employee who's, got the same track record, and they're trying to decide whether to fire the person. And then just notice, like, what would your reaction be to observing them in that situation? Like, what would your advice be? And, very often it's quite striking to notice how differently you would judge a situation when all you change is just whether it's you or not who's the main
Yeah.
character. So that's like one of a number of different thought experiments that I and other people have found useful on a regular basis. And then another kind of like regularly useful habit that you could consider adopting is betting, or at least like thinking about how you would bet. So I have a chapter where I talk about how, like, very often what we're doing when we like form a judgment or tell ourselves something is it's kind of akin to a press secretary. So at a company, you can think of, there's a press secretary, then there's like the board. And the press secretary's role is just to tell the public or the press things that, make the company seem like look good, and that he's not like really concerned about whether they're true. He's just concerned with like, are these plausible enough that I can get away with saying them, right? And so we're often very much in that mode. And whereas the board, their job is to actually just make decisions, like make bets where, there are real stakes. And if they make the wrong decision, the company will suffer. And if they make the right decision, the company will thrive. So just thinking about how you would bet on a belief, even if you can't actually bet on it, can shift you away from the press secretary mode into the, board decision-making mode. For example, say you have the belief like our servers are secure, let's say. So that might really feel true to you. But then if you ask yourself, like, would I be willing to bet on that belief? And sometimes you have to get creative about thinking about like, what would a bet entail? But you could imagine that bet is like, okay, we'll hire a hacker, and if they can, break into our servers in the next 5 hours, then I lose the bet and I have to pay $1,000. And so just making that concrete and noticing, like, do I feel excited to take this bet because I'm confident I'll win? Or do I feel a little hesitant because now I'm not so sure anymore if our servers are as secure as I thought? Just that kind of frame shift can make you realize that, like, actually, the thing I was telling myself, I'm not sure I believe it anymore. So I often do this kind of like make the claim concrete to think about whether I would bet something on it. And then I guess the last thing I'll say, which is probably the most important, is just cultivating the habit of noticing when you're in soldier mindset, which might sound backwards, but one of the core themes of the book is that soldier mindset is really innate and really universal. And so if you never notice yourself in soldier mindset, then, what's more likely, that you're like the one exception to humanity or that you just aren't all that self-aware? So, I think noticing yourself in soldier mindset and starting to notice like what it feels like when you're rationalizing, or the kinds of situations where you tend to be defensive, that kind of self-awareness is a really crucial step towards shifting into scout mindset. And so when you notice that, you should be, happy that you noticed, and not disappointed.
I can't wait until it's just frictionless to be able to bet on stuff and to be able
Right?
to track those,
Yeah.
encourage other people to bet.
We're heading slowly in that direction.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You haven't seen BitClout, have you?
No, I haven't.
it's a people stock market. It's basically, imagine Twitter, but like your followers own your coin, and as they buy more, your stock goes up. As they sell, your stock goes down.
Oh God.
Yeah, so
I'm stressed out just thinking about this.
yeah, and you don't have to play, but there are dystopian ways it could go, but it could also go like, hey, as people gain more trust in like, it could be a correcting mechanism as well.
Nice.
But yeah, it's interesting to see what will happen there. So we've talked about it from an individual level. How about on a organizational level? Like if you were, the CEO of a company and you're trying to think about how can I adopt Scout mindset in my culture, and what sort of, different, whether it's principles or rituals I could adopt to make my organization more Scout oriented. What Scout mindset oriented? What might you recommend?
Yeah, I think this group level or community level perspective is really important because, as I say, we humans are not these single itemized creatures reasoning in isolation. Like our thinking habits and styles are largely the function of the people we surround ourselves with. So I think the kinds of behaviors you reward and punish are the kinds of behaviors that will, flourish or die out. And so there's a lot of different ways you can, or like different aspects of Scout mindset that you can encourage in your group by rewarding them. So for example, like at some organizations I've worked with, when someone like makes an explicit prediction, people will express appreciation for that. Explicit in the sense of like, we will find out if they're right or wrong. They like stuck their neck out, and so even if they're wrong, you want like the overall sentiment towards them to be appreciation that they actually made an explicit prediction. Thank you. Similarly, like showing appreciation to someone, like explicitly calling someone out positively for having, like one woman at an organization I know of, she had been lobbying for a particular change, and she'd kind of gotten some people behind her, and then she kind of reran the numbers and like got some more information and ended up deciding, actually, I think this wouldn't be a good investment for us. And it was hard for her to admit that because she had been kind of the champion of this idea. But she was like, I can't keep standing behind this idea if I no longer think it's good. And so she told people she changed her mind, and they were really appreciative because many people in that situation would just have barreled ahead with it because they didn't want to, like admit they had been wrong. So anyway, just recognizing the behaviors that contribute to a culture of Scout mindset and rewarding those, I think is at the bottom level. That's really all. That's all there is to it.
It's interesting because one thing I'm just sort of thinking about out loud is there's this, if I would sort of segment out, how strong someone comes across in a conversation, and if someone was trying to, be least, or, result in them, the other partner being least defensive. I think there's like a few levers. One is the tone of, and two is like the word choice that, because some things are just more aggressive than some words are more aggressive than
accusatory words or something, as opposed to, describing your own reactions.
Yes. Or even like words that mean the same thing, but some imply guilt and some don't. I don't have an example at the top of my head.
Yeah.
And then third is like the actual substance of what is being communicated. And I think another person that comes to mind who does this really well, I think Patrick Carlson and you both, by tone and sort of like word choice, come across not as harmless, but like as not, accusatory or attacking. I think
good.
You could have a conversation with like Coleman Hughes, for example, on a, fairly sensitive topic, but do so, or incendiary topic for some people. But sort of like you do a good job of not setting off tripwires, even though the substance of it itself could be like not what people want to hear or something. And it just, if one is trying to get across, something that is substantively, different, like controversial, but you're trying to express your opinion. If one is able to also to make the tone and the word choice not a additional sort of like, because then people will focus on the tone or focus on the content or the word choice, or it'll just elevate that conflict. I'm curious if, yeah.
That's such a good observation, and also thank you. It's a praise that I like especially appreciate because I like, you know how nice it is to be praised for something you've been like explicitly trying to do. And also it's very nice to be, put in the company of Patrick calls and in conversation. Yeah, but it's an excellent observation because the way I think of it is you have kind of like disagreeableness points that you can spend. And I'm already spending some of my disagreeableness points by just disagreeing with people, by, expressing skepticism or pushing back a little bit or, pointing out nuance or something like that. So I'm spending some of those points, and I don't want to spend any points that I don't have to spend. So if I can, find ways to, be like friendly in my tone and just, honestly signal good faith. Like, so what are some honest signals of good faith? Well, like, voluntarily pointing out exceptions to the points that I'm making, or when asking them about their view, like about a point they've made that doesn't seem right to me or doesn't make sense. Sometimes I'll like try to volunteer, like, well, maybe you meant such and such, and maybe I'm wrong about what they meant, but at least I'm showing that I'm like looking for reasonable or like charitable interpretations of what they said, or like looking for ways to interpret what they're saying that make sense to me. So even if I'm wrong, I'm showing that I'm like trying to understand them instead of just looking for ways to rebut them. So, and yeah, not overstating your case, like acknowledging when, there's a point that's more speculative instead of something you're 100% sure about. I think all of that goes a really long way towards making people willing to listen to the content of your perhaps disagreeable substance.
Yeah. We've been talking about soldier mindset, partially in the capacity of entrepreneurship and working relationships. How do you see people benefiting from applying scout mindset in their personal friendships or relationships, or common ways in which soldier mindset gets them tricked up?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many opportunities for self-deception and rationalization and defensiveness in relationships. Well, I'll just give you one example that happened to me kind of recently. So I talk about this a bit in the chapter. I call it Coping with Reality, and it's about, sort of to the point I was making earlier, about finding ways to like comfort or reassure yourself, basically ways to feel better in stressful situations without resorting to self-deception. And so one of those ways is to basically, before you try to figure out, is this upsetting possibility true? Before you try to think about that, first ask yourself, what would I do if it was true? Like, imagine it's true. How would you deal with that? How bad would it be? Oh, sorry. And the point being that, like, once you've figured out, like, okay, here's how I would tell my team if I realized I had made a mistake. Once you have that plan, then it's much easier to think clearly about, like, okay, is this actually the situation I'm in? The reason I bring this up is that there's often, a situation where you think you might be in the wrong, but you don't really want to admit it to yourself. And so you like are hard at work trying to come up with rationalizations for why you're definitely not in the wrong. And so in my case, I was kind of worried I had done something like inconsiderate to a friend. So I was kind of arguing with myself about, like, do I need to apologize? And so I told myself alternately sometimes, like, no, I didn't do anything wrong. Like, I'm sure she didn't notice. And then other times I told myself, I'm sure she's forgotten already, which those were like internally contradictory justifications, which I'll set that aside. But anyway, it was a sign that like I wasn't fully convincing myself with these justifications. And so then I did this exercise that I was describing, and I asked myself, okay, suppose I had to apologize. How would I do it? And I was able to pretty quickly like draft in my head, okay, here's like a basic apology I could give that I feel comfortable giving. And I kind of imagined how she would react. And I was like, I think it would be so bad. Like, I bet she'd be appreciative. Yeah, I guess this isn't so bad. And so then once I had done that, I was able to return to the original question, should I apologize? And then the answer was very clear, like, yes, I should apologize. And so I think there are a lot of situations like that where just finding a way to make yourself open to considering the possibility that, that you might be wrong, or that you might, need to have a difficult conversation with someone, or that you might need to break up, or that, etc. Finding ways to make yourself open to seriously and honestly considering those possibilities can be really valuable.
Yeah. I want to sort of close by not just promoting the Scout mindset, but also some of your broader work. Just giving a
Oh,
preview.
thanks.
So you've been doing your podcast, rationally speaking, for maybe a decade, maybe more. I mean, it seems
Over a
like
decade now. Yeah.
quite a
Yeah.
long time.
2010 is when it started. Good Lord.
How
I'm
do
so
you
old.
how do you define, and this was when podcasts were like fairly you were early adopters
Yeah.
of podcasts. How do you
No, but
what
now I'm like, I'm like, the cities that first adopted subway systems, like New York, and now they're just stuck with these like creaky, old, grimy subway systems. Whereas these like new adopter countries, like in Asia, can build these gleaming new
yeah,
systems. So I'm still stuck like using all my old methods.
that's
I really need to like update my podcasting methods.
totally. But it's still quite good. I'm a fan. What determines the speakers and the topics that you cover? Is it just pure curiosity? How do you sort of define your show?
Ah, that's such a great question. I don't get to talk about that often enough. It's a delicate balance. Ideally, I guess I have like two kinds of guests to vastly oversimplify. So one kind of guest is they're an expert in a topic that I'm really curious about. And so I want to ask them a bunch of questions about like, how does this thing work? How does, willpower work? How does consciousness work, et cetera? And then another kind of guest is a guest with like a thesis. Their thesis is like Brian Kaplan came on the show and argued that education was overrated and basically like we should like cut education in half. And so sometimes there's a guest with a thesis and I'm very excited to, argue with their thesis in a friendly way. And the tricky part in choosing guests is choosing someone whose views are at least somewhat different from mine, ideally, because otherwise I could just talk to myself, but who also is kind of willing to play the game I'm trying to play. And by play the game, I mean, like, they actually listen to my questions and, try to honestly answer them instead of what many guests do, which is to kind of use my questions as like a pivot to share their talking points and not actually try to engage with my questions. And ideally, they also, they're like happy to answer questions about evidence, like, well, how do you know that the evidence supports your theory more than this alternate theory that it also seems consistent with? And so the best guests are the ones that hear those questions and they're all excited to talk about like, yes, so, here are the potential like ways my theory could be wrong. Here's what I think about them. And they don't feel threatened by those questions. So sometimes I, misfire a bit, but that's like what I'm going for in a guest.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then also let's end where we began, just in terms of like you talking about the work that you've done previous to this book and sort of the broader, community or collection of communities that has comprised your work. What would you say is the overlap between sort of like the rationality community or some of the work that has come out of adjacent communities and sort of Daniel Kahneman's sort of or more just like, or Dan Ariely's, or more just like behavioral economics, more or psychology more broadly? Where does it overlap, or where does it differ, maybe?
Great question. So Daniel Kahneman and Dan Ariely, so they wrote Thinking Fast and Slow and Predictably Irrational, respectively, plus some other books. Their work is more about like cataloging the cognitive biases that humans are subject to. It's less about, proposing solutions. So that was I mean, I'm indebted to their work and I'm not meaning to criticize it at all. I was taking it kind of as the jumping off point for, okay, where do we go from here?
Yeah. And what do you say to the like big simplification? If your work has been trying to help people like think better and make better decisions, what would you say to this like radically different straw man, which is like, who is the group that is trying to make people like feel better or be more in touch with their feelings or navigate their feelings? And sort of like whatever that group is, what is the overlap between that group and your group?
Well, I'm definitely in favor of getting people to feel better. And I think that is often a side effect of Scout mindset. Like I think often, at least if you're approaching it the right way, seeing things accurately and like being honest with yourself about what you actually think, that often does make you feel better. But yeah, I guess a complaint that I often have about like self-help or things in that space that are aimed at making people feel better is that I wish they like cared more about truth. I
Yeah.
was trying to find like a more sophisticated or subtle way to say it. No, I wish they cared more about truth. Because I think, you know, we don't have to choose between like feeling better and seeing things clearly, at least the vast majority of the time. Certainly like that trade-off exists to a far less extent than people think it does. And so it just seems like such a shame to me to like sacrifice our judgment, to sacrifice our ability to see clearly in exchange for some short-term happiness, especially when there are other solutions that don't require that sacrifice.
Yeah. What do you say to the sort of like, again, to simplify radically, the sort of, the mistake theory of the view of the world, which is, hey, if people just had the same information
Oh
or
yeah.
knowledge, they would, get along, or we'd all sort of, see that we have, to radically simplify, versus like the conflict theory view of the world, which is, actually there's like a limited amount of resources, limited amount of or semi-limited amount of resource, semi-limited amount of status,
Right.
or even if there is, unlimited resources, there's semi-limited status. And so actually the like truth of it all is that we are in fundamental conflict over that same status. And thus it's actually better to like either not know the truth or pretend like, find some other ways. Like it's the noble lie that basically we shouldn't, it's not that we need to all just get on the same page such that we, can get along better. It's actually, how do we tell ourselves stories that help us get through the day and help us get through working well with each other, even
Yeah.
when the truth is that sometimes it might not be in our best interest or something.
Yeah. So that dichotomy of like worldviews that you're talking about, mistake theory and conflict theory, was I think proposed by Scott Alexander
Yeah.
on the now defunct blog Slate Star Codex,
Mm-hmm.
and I loved it. It like clarified something that I'd only been half aware of, and also changed my thinking to some degree. I think it's great. Its relationship to Scout and Soldier mindset is kind of complicated, and I'd have to think more about it. But I think you could, at least in theory, be like strongly conflict theory, but still in Scout mindset. You could just be like trying to be like really clear-eyed about how to defeat the enemy, like the
Yeah.
other side. But like my broader reaction to the mistaken conflict theory dichotomy is just like clearly both are true to some extent. Like clearly it is partly true that like a lot of the time people who seem to be your enemies are actually, well intentioned. They just have like a very different picture of the world than you do, and one of you or both of you are wrong to some extent.
Yeah.
And so like there is a role for like it is really important and valuable to like try to reason with each other and try to, change minds through like truth oriented processes instead of through like what I sometimes call the dark arts,
Yeah.
like through like deception or manipulation or kind of like like sketchy persuasion, or just like through active violence. So like clearly to some extent mistake theory is correct, but it is limited. Like there are limited resources in the world, and people, have, as you put it really well, actually. I don't need to like restate what you just said, but yeah, like competition for status and resources are absolutely a real thing. I guess in general, I would say it seems like the human tendency is to err too much towards assuming conflict, and that like if someone seems to like have different goals from you, then they're probably like evil and, stubborn and can't be reasoned with and should instead be fought. And that, I mean, not to like pretend to be an evolutionary psychologist or anything, but that kind of makes sense to me why we would have evolved to like have that default, since we grew up in tribes who had to defend themselves from outsiders. But so yeah, so even though there's some truth to both, I would guess that we by default err too much towards the side of conflict theory. And so I think if I were going to try to push in one direction, I'd try to push towards mistake theory and push people towards thinking like, are you sure the person who seems like a completely evil monster really is? Or do you think maybe you're like misunderstanding their beliefs, or maybe they're just confused, or, are you sure
Yeah.
there's no role for like reasoned conversation?
Yeah. I agree with that. Maybe gearing towards wrapping here. We were just discussing Scott Alexander. He had this great
Yeah.
blog post we're just wrapping up sort of like the last decade of his thinking. and it was this great summary. And I'm curious if the sort of, if you, him, some of the other sort of like central figures of sort of the broader, decentralized movement were to do that same sort of reflection, but for like the broader space, how you think the ethos of the space or something about the space has evolved between 2010 and 2020. Like if someone was, deep in less wrong in 2010 or whatever was going on then, and like went in a coma and came back in 2020, obviously the world has changed, but of course, the movement has evolved, in some way too. What do you think would be sort of like the biggest difference or most surprising? And I segue that to also ask you, like, in the next, like where do you expect the movement to go? Like in the next, like, few years, how might you expect it to evolve based on how it's evolved in the past 10?
Wow, that's such a great question. It's not one that I have like a really clear, pre-made answer to. I guess just thinking out loud, I mean, one big difference is that the effective altruist movement, that hypothetical less wronger who went to sleep in 2010 and woke up in 2020, they would be, surprised by the existence of the effective altruist movement, which I wouldn't say it grew out of the rationalist movement because it kind of had its own origins, but the ethos is very similar, and there's a lot of social overlap. Where the ethos of effective altruism is trying to find ways to do the most good possible using like logic and reason and evidence, and so it's basically trying to apply rationality to the specific goal of doing as much good as possible. So that's a big change. And I sometimes will identify as, like, if I'm trying to introduce myself to the outside world, I'll sometimes identify as an effective altruist rather than a rationalist. If I have to identify as anything,
Yes.
just because it's like a little easier to explain. So that's one thing. I think our hypothetical Rip Van less wronger would be surprised at how mainstream the issue of AI risk and AI safety is.
Yeah.
Like, I still kind of boggle at it. Like in 2010, there was just this small group of like rationalists, mainly in the Bay Area, I guess, and to some extent Oxford, who were talking about like, as artificial intelligence gets more advanced, it seems like there's like the real risk that goals of the artificial intelligence won't be perfectly aligned with what's good for humans. I wonder if we should think about this some more. And that was just like this kind of weird, like, fringe topic to pay attention to that no one else was really taking seriously. And now it's, a very mainstream thing that people in the government are worried about, and top AI researchers who've written AI textbooks like Stuart Russell are worried about. And so that's a huge change. In terms of like the general movement, there hasn't really been an attempt to like grow, like scale up and grow the rationalist movement to be worldwide. I think partly because rationalist types just tend to not be super interested in that.
Yeah.
They'd rather stay kind of small and weird, and not big and normal. So so that maybe hasn't changed as much as you would have thought it would. And then you said going forward, Scott Alexander has definitely created a huge community around himself. He's kind of like part of the less wrong diaspora, and I feel like his ethos is still pretty close to the center of the spirit of less wrong, the principles of, epistemic humility and probabilistic thinking and being analytical and, being really interested in figuring out the evidence on complicated topics. So that's still like pretty less wrong, but I guess he's, there used to be kind of like a rule, I forget if it was official or unofficial on less wrong, to not talk about politics, just because it's so hard to have like a reasonable and civil conversation about politics. So that people were just like, let's just not deal with that. And Scott has clearly set that rule aside. So I think that's, and on balance, I'm glad he did. And I think it's nice that he's playing on hard mode on a very important topic.
Yeah. No, totally. I think that's a good place to wrap. Julia, can you, for people who are interested in learning more, and I highly recommend they do, where and when can they get Scout Mindset?
Yeah, so the Scout Mindset is coming out April 13th, but you can pre-order it now, and pre-orders are lovely for authors. So if you think you might be interested in buying it sometime in the next couple of weeks would be awesome. So there's an Amazon page and a Penguin Random House page for the Scout Mindset. You can just Google it, and then my website is juliagalef.com. And there's a book page on there as well, and also links to like my YouTube channel and my podcast, Rationally Speaking. Or you can just go to rationallyspeakingpodcast.org.
I highly recommend.
And follow me on Twitter, Julia Galef.
Yes. Yes, I recommend buying the book, checking out the podcast, and Julia, you're back on Twitter?
I'm back. Yes, I was gone for a while, in part to finish writing the book, which was taking me a long time. But I'm back now and jumping into the fray.
The library inside of a civil war, as
I never heard that. I love it.
that's Balaji's term, of course, for
Oh,
Balaji.
great.
It is a civil war, or it's more of a civil war than for others. But Julia, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a great
Oh, my
episode.
pleasure. This is so fun. Thanks, Erik.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.